we're going to start things off today by taking a look at what's making news in the markets. During USDA's annual Ag Outlook Forum, they forecast 2021 corn plantings at 92 million acres and soybeans at 90 million acres. That would be the largest ever combined plantings for the two crops. North Dakota State University's Frayne Olson joined me to discuss those numbers and what has already been a tremendous year for corn and soybeans.
Yeah, I guess they're not terribly shocking numbers. I know when I kind of put my estimates together before the report came out, I was looking at maybe a little bit more soybean acres. I think the corn numbers that USDA came out with very similar to what I was expecting to see. I think we might see a little bit of an increase in the soybean acreage. Now, one of the things I want to remind everybody is for the final plantings numbers, I think those will be relatively close. But on March 31, we're going to get the prospective plantings report, and I do think we'll probably see a little heavier shift to soybeans, but then some adjustments after that, and we'll probably come into more of a typical balance.
And Frayne, next up, when we were preparing for this interview, you said that you're getting more questions about the battle for acres, where specialty crop producers are adjusting their pre-plant contracts to be more competitive and not lose too many acres. Could you give us a little background on that and the advice you've given?
Sure. And I've had quite a few meetings, both a few in person, but most of them virtual, where I've talked to farmers about that. We're back into this area where we're battling for acres. We're trying to figure out how many acres do we have amongst, in particular, the major commodities. And of course, in North Dakota here, we produce corn, soybeans, as well as spring wheat. So we've got all the major markets covered. But we also have a lot of specialty crops, or what I call small market crops, where they're important to the individual farmers that grow those crops, but they're not necessarily a big acreage. You know, and some of those, for example, would be canola or sunflower. We have a lot of dry edible beans in the area. We have some field pea and lentil. We've got oats and flax, malt barley. There's a lot of these specialty crops that are growing. And as I talk to the processors that are trying to pre-plant contract for those commodities, they're really struggling right now, saying, boy, given the rise and increase we've seen in the major crops like corn and soybeans, we've got to readjust our pricing mechanisms and our contract offerings to try and compensate so we don't lose too many acres. And that's been a struggle for not only the processors, but now I'm getting questions from farmers saying, well, how much higher will some of these contract prices go for some of these specialty crops?
And then I guess, Frayne, if we get another prevent plant this year, we can just rip these numbers up and throw them away, huh?
Yeah, and I guess I was going through some of those numbers the last couple of days because there's a question coming up, where are we going to find all these acres? If we have a slight increase in winter wheat, if we hold the spring wheat acres, if we have this rebound now in soybean acres, a slight increase in corn, cotton is looking at a flat to slightly increased cotton acreage, where are all these acres coming from? And I remind everybody, in 2020, we had a pretty large prevent plant year nationally, and in particular in this area, just in North Dakota, we had about 3 million acres of prevent plant. And given the dry soil conditions we have right now, both starting last fall and now going into this spring, a lot of those prevent plant acres from 2020 will get seeded this year. And then you think about the prairie pothole region that extends from North Dakota, South Dakota, and parts of northwest Iowa. And a lot of those prevent plant acres, because it's so dry, will come back into production. So we're not going to have zero prevent plant, but obviously we're not going to have the levels we saw in 2020. So we could easily pick up, 6 million acres worth of prevent plant from last year that could be seeded this year.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about harvest progress in South America. So in Brazil, harvest is 15% complete, and that's the slowest pace in the last 10 years. And half of where Brazil was a year ago. Is that as big of a deal as it sounds?
Partially. So again, there's some short-term implications, some long-term ones. The short-term implications, we knew that the harvest in Brazil, especially northern Brazil, was going to be delayed because it was very dry in northern Brazil, especially in that Mato Grosso region this last spring. So the farmers just held off planting until they got the rains. Now what's happened is, as we get closer to harvest, again in northern Brazil, they're getting some additional rains, which is now slowing up harvest because their fields are too wet. The other thing we're watching in northern Brazil is typically they have a first crop corn and a second crop corn. The first crop corn is planted and harvested just like soybeans in Brazil. The second crop corn, which is actually the larger crop, the safrinha crop, is planted after the soybeans have been harvested, especially again in the Mato Grosso growing region. So the harvest delays in soybeans are now causing some issues for replanting corn for their second crop safrinha. And that might have a longer term impact on corn prices globally, depending upon how quickly they can get back in the fields and get those corn acres planted. When we get into central and southern Brazil, they haven't quite started harvest yet, but their yields are expected to be much better. So if you look at the average yield across the whole state, the whole country of Brazil, they're going to have a pretty typical or average yield across the whole country.
And finally, Frayne, I want to get in a viewer question this week. Looking down the line, this viewer wants to know your thoughts on how a summer drought in the Midwest might impact corn prices. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and that's something obviously we're watching very closely. Again, if you use the drought monitor maps as a proxy, the central part of the U.S. In the plain states are very dry. You get into northwest Iowa, they also have some very, very dry conditions. It really hasn't moved into southeastern Iowa or into Illinois or Indiana, the eastern corn belt yet, but the western corn belt is dry, which means we're really going to be living rain shower to rain shower most of the summer. So the weather forecasts are going to be very important. I think we're going to have considerable volatility in both the corn and the soybean markets because our ending stocks number, especially for soybeans, is so tight. So we're putting a lot of pressure and really relying on a very good 2021 crop to be able to help rebuild some of those reserves. So I think we're going to have some, the weather forecasts as usual are going to be watched very closely this year, and it could have a substantial impact on both corn and soybeans. My suspicion is a larger impact on soybeans just because we have very thin carryover stocks coming in from 2020. The corn carryover stocks are tight, but not nearly as tight as they are for soybeans.